Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. I'm Blurry. A little bit about myself. I still don't understand how CDs work. So, pretty good matches here. Djokovic, Fritz, Lehechka against Alcaraz. Felix and De Minaur are listed here, but that'll be the day after. Quarterfinals for Lehechka is really impressive. Good result for him. He's had a good game for a while. A ton of power, a lot of promise in his game. When he plays well, it's behind a really effective quality of spot serving. His ground strokes are huge also. He's a skillful player, but, a little bit like Struff in the sense that he can get a bit handcuffed by the ball. Things can get a little awkward, but, when he's timing the ball right and he's seeing it clearly and he's playing ideal opponents, plays really well. Obviously, playing Alcaraz, not a good time. Not the opponent you want in the quarters. But Lehechka hasn't done terribly against him. I'm using Flash Score for this because some of the head-to-head information is interesting here. And I think at this point in the tournament, everyone's kind of following the scorelines. So they just played in London. It went to 3. Lehechka lost that match. No shame there. It's a good sign that he can score on serve against Alcaraz. Alcaraz is a pretty good returner, but some guys are still able to score on him when they're serve, and some guys aren't at all. So good signs for Lehechka. Lehechka also beat him in Doha, I think. Yeah. Doha, he beat him in 3, as a big underdog. That was a pretty surprising win. For me, I think Alcaraz puts the ball back too often for Lehechka with pace. And one of the things Lehechka likes to do is out-hit his opponent. And if his opponent's hitting the ball harder, he tends to lose, control of the length of his shots. He can send the ball long a bit. Not as good of a backhand as Alcaraz, but he uses the slice, enough to be able to deal with some of the pace and power. The slice isn't really an effective shot as a main weapon, but I think having it in a reliable manner makes you able to deal with things maybe other players aren't, because quickly to go to that shot if you're a bit rushed. And, it forces Alcaraz to create, which is, not a good long-term plan. But on an isolated point, he can mistime a forehand or two. He can get a little impatient. So good to kind of force him to think every so often. I don't really like Lehechka in this matchup. Alcaraz has been really good. Had an injury timeout against Rinderknecht. Seemed, not 100%, but still won in straight sets. Rinderknecht served well. Getting straight setted is fine. Carlos serving above 60% is good. It's a match where I'm adding a tiny question mark to him, and he still is 36-11, winners to unforced errors. So not a ton of complex analysis there. I just think that Alcaraz overall is just too good defensively, and I think his backhand is a bit better. So Lehechka has to do a lot to win a point. So not really a clear path to victory here for them. In a 2 out of 3 setup, he has a better chance to sprint through a set and then, serve well for a few games early in a third. 3 out of 5, I don't see it. I think Alcaraz is playing better. And Lehechka is very talented, but is just starting to back up the results. I think he underperformed in some stretches of seasons in the past. And, for him, the level he's playing at now is the best maybe he's ever played and the most consistent. So it's a brand new level, and it's just getting up to the point where, you put him in that discussion with Alcaraz. Take out the results. The results are good, but they're at minor events. So beating him at a major is tricky. I think he'll win a set. Rinderknecht was very close to getting one, but winning the match I think is a bit out of the question. So I like Alcaraz in 4 there. Djokovic Fritz is a, big upset alert here because, Djokovic has taken an injury timeout in every single match so far. He had his arm worked on last match. He had his neck, massaged. I think, not a huge issue because, Djokovic won these matches fairly comfortably. But, just, a sign that there could be a question if he has to play a really long match with it. I think Fritz will be a pretty long match. Struff was pretty harmless. I think he just can't. He just has no rally tolerance to play with Djokovic. Djokovic hits his return just to Struff's backhand, and Struff hits the ball in the net. I didn't see the unforced error total, but yeah, 19-32. 32 feels like fewer than I saw, and I only saw half the match. When Struff lands his first serve, he starts to look somewhat effective. Anytime he doesn't, he's in huge trouble. I bet the second serve percentage was low. Take a look. Yeah, 40% is not really good for a guy whose, main attribute is serving. So Djokovic had a pretty easy time there. 12 aces and 0 double faults is hilariously good. So Djokovic comes into this in incredible form. The only slight question mark is just about durability. I do think, I'll show you here. This minus 200 price is very, very low for Djokovic. I kind of look at things in terms of ranges, and different players have different ranges that they're priced at in different situations. And when they get into certain territories, it sort of signals that they're a bit vulnerable. Generally, it's not an axiom, but it's a partial truth. So I think there's trouble here, and that's doubly alarming maybe because Fritz is 0-10, I think, against Djokovic. Yeah, that's 10 of them. So if you like seeing Novak Djokovic's name in bold letters, this portion of the video is for you. Here you go. It's very nice. Oh, it's so nice. The best chance, I think, there was a match where Djokovic had that abdominal tear, and couldn't really move through sections of the match, and Fritz, was able to get to a fifth. In that match, there was a pretty fortuitous break, when they enforced curfew. That let Djokovic get himself back together. He was off court for 10, 15 minutes, able to regroup and win that match. Very interesting that he was able to do that within a match. I don't know what happened off court. Maybe massages, maybe the physio knows the right stretches. There's doubt in my mind about how someone can recover from something that looks so catastrophic in terms of the player's reaction and hampered movement. But, I'm not a physical therapist. I don't have that knowledge. And sometimes, people can provide quick fixes, So, not accusing him of dark magic or anything. I don't know what I'm getting at there. I just think it's, when you take the off-court medical timeout, I think it'd be interesting to know what they're really able to do there, what they give you. I guess painkillers work really well, and that's why people don't generally take them, because you can worsen the injury because you're able to just play through it. But still, I think even on the significant, even with the receptors dampened, I think there's a level of injury where you just can't, make the motion. And in that match, it seemed like he came back and was almost healthy for the fifth set. So, it speaks to a strange situation here, because in the past, Fritz has been, at times he was helpless against Djokovic because he doesn't really hit the ball hard enough to score from the baseline. Fritz has a really good technique on his forehand and backhand. They're very reliable. He can rally all day if he wants to. Now he's in shape to do it. He's been playing more consistently this season. But, against Djokovic, I think the player able to hit the ball and slide it through the court and get depth is always Djokovic in this matchup. So Fritz is able to make things competitive, but Djokovic gets to choose when he wants to go, for rally-ending shots. And it's been difficult for Fritz, especially, Fritz has a great serve, but not as huge as some of the biggest servers who can actually, cause Djokovic to have to lunge and stuff. Djokovic is able to get, a good amount of returns in play. That might change here a little, as he ages a little bit, if he's feeling a little soreness. For me, I thought using the medical timeouts was a good move for Djokovic. Why wait till things become an issue? Why not get treat? He got an arm massage. It looked more helpful than a major issue that he was having. It looked more like he thought it was a good idea to get his arm, worked out a little bit in the middle of the match, and that's intelligent. Djokovic is smart, if you didn't know. So I think Fritz is serving better here than he ever has. He's in better shape. His backhand is going down the line well. He's hitting the ball a bit bigger. I think the wins, on tour this season for him have made him open up his game a bit. He's more confident. He's more comfortable playing with more variety. I saw him hit some good lobs over players when he brought them to net recently. And it's not so difficult to hit a lob. It's not like he's added that to his game, but I think it shows a comfort and calm level on the court to do that in a big moment. A lot of times these players get frantic and they tend to just hit the ball as hard as they can on every shot when it's a big moment, or try to hope the ball into play. But he's really not doing that. He's gotten better, and it makes this a close match. No one really has given Djokovic significant trouble so far. Norrie started to make things look tricky, and then got rolled. Struff, I think I saw, they expected something like 37 and a half games or more before the match. I don't know if Struff has won 37 and a half games against Djokovic lifetime. It's just, it's just a really bad matchup for him. Fritz should do better than Norrie. He's way better than Norrie at this point. So, at least one set, I'd say he can win. The American crowd is active, I guess is the nicest way I can put it. They're willing to do, there are a significant number of people in the stands who are willing to do whatever it takes to get their player across the finish line. That will help Fritz. It's not the way I think he would want to get things done. But Djokovic can get frustrated, but he's a good villain. He knows how to play with the crowd, but he also can get frustrated by them. He gets frustrated by rude behavior just like anyone else, and he shows it. And, whether that fires him up, and if he wins the next few games, the announcers will say, oh, you got the wrong guy mad. But, it also fires the crowd up. If they get the chance to boo somebody, if they get a reaction, now they're involved for the rest of the match. So I think this will be interesting to see if Djokovic can, keep things calm and subdued. Just play solid tennis, because I think players forget about their fans forget about their allegiances somewhat when the quality of play is really good, which it should be here. As far as who I like, hard to pick against Djokovic when he's 10-0 against a player. Fritz has gotten better. This is the best he's ever been against Djokovic, so definitely a chance here. Playing well at his home slam. Mahatch was playing well coming into that match, and Fritz just blanked him. Mahatch just really wasn't able to out-rally him. And it sort of looked a bit like, the Fritz versus Djokovic matchup from the past. Mahatch just wasn't able to create and get out of rallies. And when you are in rallies and you want to score and the errors are flowing, it's just hard to reset and think that you're going to outlast a player. I assume that players know who's better from the baseline, who can go longer. Only question mark here for Djokovic, I think, is physical stamina. How strong he is. He's playing incredibly. He's serving well. He looks solid. There's no knee brace on. There's no lingering injury issues here. There have been some tweaks and some minor things in past matches. So, the job here for Fritz is pretty simple. Make the match go 4 hours or more if you can, and hope that Djokovic has some significant issue, because then he has a chance. If Djokovic is healthy, I think he just wins in 4 very close sets. He seems to be the guy right behind Alcaraz and Sinner, in terms of tennis quality right now. He seems to be playing well. Wasn't completely healthy early in the season also. So obviously aging doesn't, you don't get better with age, but injuries aren't necessarily age. Sure, they're a factor. You're more likely to accumulate injuries as you age, and parts wear out. But, during those periods where he's not 100%, you kind of have to put the asterisk there and say that he's not really, this doesn't really count towards his ceiling, that he could be playing better tennis were those injuries not present, And so if they're not there here, great. I think he wins in 4 sets, or Fritz wins in 5 sets. There's just a lot of there's a lot of alarm for me when I see Djokovic he opened maybe minus 180. There's a lot of alarm for me when I see numbers like that. And sure, there's a ton of American bettors. Part of it is when people play in their home, play a tournament in their home country, you're expecting, higher investment on a certain side. But it's also Novak Djokovic. The big three are the biggest markets and have been for a really long time. So, if you see Alcaraz, you won't see Alcaraz lower than minus 300 unless he's playing, one of the other top five and they have a significantly good chance. So here, I think, it's a really good chance. Fritz is playing really well. If I didn't know tennis and I had watched them progress through the draw, I'd be saying, these two guys are both really good. This is going to be a good match. So that's what I'm saying here, On the women's side, two solid matchups as well. Me getting all these right at this point is not really the most important thing to me. I just want to talk through the matchups as best as I can. The picks are tricky because, these players are playing so well. Late in the tournament, everyone is kind of at their peak, and where that peak isn't something we regularly get to see because, at minor events, players are not as committed. And these are big moments which bring out different elements of people's personalities and games and, their momentum shifts. And, that's what makes it entertaining. It's like watching a movie when you get to these matches. In some sense, I don't want to know what the movie is. A lot of times if the match is going exactly as I expected, I won't enjoy watching it as much, or I just won't tune in, because I kind of, I said this to someone earlier today, like there's a quote from Alan Watts where he says, a future you can predict is basically the past, you've already had it. So that's how it kind of feels sometimes with sports. You want that uncertainty. So I'm happy to be wrong here. I'd be happy to be right too. Pegula played great against Ann Lee. Great stats. I think she served above 60%. No, she didn't. 56, not the best. Two aces. Only had one break point against her, which is pretty good. Ann Lee's pretty aggressive, so just really too much rally tolerance, I think, for Pegula in that. And I think that's what is the key for her in the next matchup, because she's had trouble against Krejcikova. So, this situation is one where I'll kind of draw on this Townsend Krejcikova matchup. This was a crazy match. Townsend was up a set and a break. It was a dominant first set from her. She was playing incredibly well. Her forehand inside out was scoring regularly. She was up a break in the second. Krejcikova got it back. Very close matchup throughout. Townsend had something like 8 match points. The second set tiebreaker, if it's on YouTube, go watch it. It was the best tiebreaker I saw this year. Every single player just played incredibly well on the big points. Krejcikova didn't really back off her offense at all. She hit the line on match points multiple times. She just played huge tennis when she absolutely needed to, and it was, watching it live was incredible. And it did end up winning her the match. She was more aggressive, and since the shots landed, she was able to win. I thought what was interesting in the match is that Townsend was more durable in the rallies. Townsend was the one who seemed like she wouldn't blink first, when they exchanged from the baseline and it was neutral. Krejcikova had trouble with her backhand, just kind of shortening up the angle. When she was going cross court from deep in the court, it seemed like she clipped the net an awful lot, and just, she didn't want to give the ball to Townsend's forehand to go down the line, and that just kind of made her too focused, I think, on making sure the net clearance was minimal. Obviously, that's a choice she made, and she won the match, so it might have been the right choice, given how aggressive Townsend is with going down the line with her forehand. Still, more of the same from Krejcikova. She just hits the ball better and better as the match goes on, and it seems to be able to win in 3 sets. It seems like when she gets to the end of a match, she's still able to hit the ball very big, and her head is clear about it, and her opponents can sometimes tighten up a bit. Great run for Townsend. She had a really good tournament. The same old controversies came up. There was a terrible story about, when she was a junior, they pulled her funding because she didn't want to, put a lot of weight into her physical state. She didn't. Look, here's the thing too. There's a lot of opinions about it. It's been talked to death. I wasn't there. I don't know what was said. I do know, some of the USTA people involved are genuinely, they seem like, a bit rude, kind of dullards. I do know that, scouts for professional sports you have to be harsh, honestly. The way I talk about tennis here is I try to be respectful of the players. I try to be balanced. If I'm thinking about, for wagering purposes or for, investing in futures, you almost have to be harsh by default. You almost have to be very critical and look at all the leaks and issues. And, if you know that professional tennis requires a certain level of training, you get scared if the players aren't, putting that in. You can point to someone maybe like, Zion Williamson or Luka Doncic, and these players in the NBA who, people criticize them for not being in peak physical shape, but they're still incredibly talented. And, I think it's how you package it. If you tell the player that, you're cutting their funding because they're not in the best shape and they're the number one junior, you look stupid, because I think that's a situation where you should take the chance. I think that you should have, the perspective that you're dealing with a junior player. You're dealing with a child, and the child doesn't have wide perspective yet, especially someone who's been in tennis. The tennis world is fairly sheltered. If you're trying to be a tennis pro, you've been doing, 90% tennis your whole life. It's been your whole world. So you're not going to, have the, the perspective to think outside the box and accept criticism, especially when the criticism seems wrong. I'm the number one player in the world. Why are you telling me I'm not good enough? And why are you telling me that someone I've been, defeating as far as the rankings is better than me and deserves this more, So I do understand the decisions. It just seems strange. And I think there are difficult decisions, I think, when it comes to these, who gets wild cards when they're juniors and who, gets these opportunities. I complained about a lot of the USTA wild cards for a while. I felt like they were propping up certain players when it would have been better for them to go to the challengers and earn it. I think Tiafoe and Fritz are tremendous players. I think that, Tiafoe made the big jump in quality when he went to Europe and grinded out some clay challengers and just competed, just poured himself into tennis. I think while you have wild cards, you get to squander opportunities, and it could be that you're not good enough yet, so the losses aren't, directly a result of you doing some big squander act, but it just feels like different players need different things. And, the USTA formula has resulted in a bunch of really solid pros. The women's game, I think especially, is a bit further along than the men's. But, it's not perfect for everyone. And, just a bad situation, I think, overall. Tough to get it dragged. It's something, it's probably hard for Taylor to put out of her mind, what she's dealing with these people, because it's the same people. If you've listened to the announcers on Tennis Channel or ESPN, it seems like it's the same people constantly. They don't check out, even if they're not necessarily the greatest at it. So has to be frustrating, to go back to that world. It's like how Serena didn't want to go back to Indian Wells, and, you have to respect players' decisions. I do, I do think, no, I don't think anything. It's just, really unfortunate. Townsend seems like a great player. I don't know if it directly affected her career. I mean, you can always train on your own. You still do get on tour. And like I said, there are other paths to it. It's just, in tennis, there aren't necessarily so many other paths. You need those opportunities. Those sponsorship dollars are huge. It costs over $100,000 to have a top junior in tennis from the time that they're very young also. So going to all those tournaments where you get the ranking points to be relevant, getting those opportunities costs money. There's a barrier to entry to it. So there's a lot of players out there who've just earned it. But, it's also nice to get fast-tracked. So I don't know what I've said or if I agree with it. But, great result for Townsend. And, I don't know. It's tough dealing with, I think, too. At some point you kind of learn that some of the adults are stupid, I think, when you're a kid and you're growing up. And it can be frustrating because you don't want to be involved in any system that they are, because the decisions they've made might be less than stellar. Their method of communication might be less than stellar. I know, never mind. But, I just heard the name McEnroe and I just thought, yeah, the guy's kind of adult in some respects, and very confident. I think it's very easy, and not totally blaming him because I don't know him personally. So it's a lot of what I've seen in public. But I think there's a tendency for people to get very, stuck in their way of thinking as they go through life. And at some point, only a major life event is really going to shake you up and make you reevaluate things. And sometimes those major life events, if they're negative, can just make you kind of harden against things and get more stubborn and more, against reflection and change. And I have, compassion for those people too, because they're suffering, kind of without realizing it. They're gritting against life. It's why it is good to just let things go. Even if you're completely justified and completely correct, it's still you that's carrying it, So what's, in the end result, if you can review your life after you're gone, would you look back and say, yeah, I'm glad I carried that with me for so long? Or would you say, I wish I didn't have to really dwell on that? I don't know. Not too important. But basically, I think, Townsend was able to be the more consistent player in baseline rallies. And I think Krejcikova ended up having to force some things. She played really well, got things right. I think that does spell a little trouble for Krejcikova because Pegula is so much more consistent from the baseline than Townsend. She's playing well. She's had a fairly simple draw, or made fairly simple work from it. Hasn't dropped a set yet. Krejcikova has dropped 2 already. Obviously, I think Navarro and Townsend are better than anyone that Pegula has played. But, Pegula being able to put the ball back flat might give Krejcikova a little bit of trouble here. That was a very emotional match also against Townsend. Pegula doesn't have the serve and the offense that Townsend did, though. So you sort of, you raise one thing, Pegula's going to get every single error that Townsend did and a handful more just by being frustrating, but not probably going to get the simple points that Townsend was able to. So, tricky match. I think I like Pegula in 3. I think, Krejcikova can win the same set that she wins against everybody, where she just kind of hits the ball cleanly to the corners and, moves in on your return. Pegula is going to have a hard time holding serve. I think, you've seen that in the past. Krejcikova beat her in 2024 in the, the World Tour Finals in Riyadh. 6-3, 6-3 is pretty dominant. I think Pegula at that point in the season was kind of toast. A lot of players will go to the World Tour Finals just for the paycheck. If you're going to Saudi Arabia, that's probably paycheck involved. This match in Dubai, Krejcikova wins. It just shows for me that Pegula is not able to completely shut down Krejcikova. So even though Pegula is favored here, I don't see a way for it to be quick. The way she hits the ball when she has time is quick enough, I think, that Krejcikova's movement will be a little bit challenged. But no quick path past Krejcikova right now. So I like Pegula in 3 there. And the other match, which is probably going to be great, is Vondrousova against Sabalenka. I spoke about this yesterday. Paolini had trouble because of her compact backhand against Vondrousova's serve. The lefty serve just bends away, and Vondrousova serves Paolini's backhand almost the entire match. Honestly, it was very impressive. It looked like when Rune plays Tsitsipas and just spams his backhand until the match is over. but this was on serve, and Vondrousova played really well besides that. But I thought she'd have a bit more trouble with Rybakina, but she didn't. Same tactics. Rybakina, had a real tough time timing the ball with her backhand, put a lot of balls in net. Not as fast as Paolini, but I thought the reach would help her just kind of block things back. Rybakina did play, a ton of exceptional tennis in this match. It was really just high level. They both sprinted, basically. Both players were just hitting the ball as fast as they could to the corners. Rybakina, even though she was down an early break, she just kept grinding until she found her rhythm. She found it, a game or two later. She was broken for 2-1, got back to 2-all, ended up losing that set. And I think that did cost her. She had momentum. I think when you get the break back early in the match and then end up losing that set, it's kind of just a big swing in momentum. You've already kind of taken the momentum away from the other player. And then if they still get the win, the other player's got to feel some relief. So even though Vondrousova loses the second set, I think there's a sense I think there's a level of stress players experience during certain parts of the match that she didn't, because she got the first set, because she knew it was pretty lucky, and because she was playing well. The second set is kind of like, let's see if I can get this too, and if I don't, we regroup, and that is what she did. She played a better third set. Rybakina had trouble keeping the ball in. I think Vondrousova's defensive presence just bothered her a bit. She was just putting the ball back a few extra times, and Rybakina doesn't really back off. So, it's one of those players where, if she's in control, she'll hit the ball right by you. If you put the ball a little bit near the baseline, she's still going to try to force things. And, she's aware that the errors are there. And so are you. So, great win for Vondrousova. She has won a major before, so there's no reason to count her out of a huge match. Just seems for me like Sabalenka, athletically is much better than Rybakina. She moves better. She's faster. She has more defensive presence. She's, willing to go to the slice at times. She'll hit a defensive lob if she's out of position. I don't think she serves as well as Rybakina, but she can serve as big. And she won the last match. It was on Cincinnati. That's pretty recent. 7-5, 6-1. Serving at 60% is pretty good. Vondrousova is 64, and I think she has to be. I think as big as Sabalenka hits the ball, Vondrousova needs to land first serves, and it might make her go a little bit less aggressive. Take a look at Sabalenka's last match to see what she was at against Buksha. 62%. So similar. Honestly, when I see Sabalenka in this, 26-18 winners to unforced errors, when I see her in the positive there, by a decent chunk, you kind of know she's playing good tennis, because she does tend to just swing for the fences when she needs to, especially in a slightly simple match like Buksha. Buksha did get close, played a solid match in the second set, but overall that was a simple one. It's players in different weight classes, I guess, at this point. So I like Sabalenka. Could go to 3. There's no reason to count Vondrousova out. She just beat Paolini, who was one of my, dark horses for this tournament. Just beat Rybakina while Rybakina was playing exceptionally well. She's had success in this matchup. She beat her in Berlin on grass, where, I know it's not the same surface, but you'd expect Sabalenka to play well. Beat her on clay, kind of expected there, but, just decent results. The match in Cincinnati kind of puts the win a little bit out of the question, but Marquette is definitely playing better than she played in Cincinnati here. So this one could be close. We saw today Felix just beat Rublev, and you're seeing that even though there's head-to-head data, and players have had success in the past, I think a lot of these players, since they're young, and since they were kind of in that second tier of major contenders for a while, that's strange to say when Vondrousova has one. But, being behind the big names and being young, when these players get to the top and start playing really well, their ceiling, again, is undefined. I talk about that too much, but, hard to tell here how good Vondrousova's, going to play here. And she is hitting her forehand very cleanly when she has time. So, Sabalenka will be up against it here. I'm expecting Sabalenka to win in 2 very close sets. So that's pretty much it. I'll put the other matches up tomorrow. And right now I'm gonna probably, head out in the street, try to find some sponsors. Let's get those sponsors. All right, later.